Sarah wheeled herself through the grand ballroom of the Riverside Country Club, her eyes wide with wonder at the sparkling chandeliers and elegant decorations. The annual charity gala was in full swing, with hundreds of well-dressed guests mingling around tables laden with expensive appetizers and champagne flutes that caught the light like tiny stars. At 17, Sarah had never been to such a fancy event. Her long brown hair was carefully styled, and she wore a beautiful navy blue dress that her mother had saved for months to buy. Despite being confined to a wheelchair since birth due to spina bifida, Sarah had always maintained an optimistic outlook on life. She was an honor student, loved to paint, and had recently been accepted to her dream college with a full scholarship. Tonight was special because Sarah had been chosen as the recipient of the club's annual scholarship award for disabled students. Her academic achievements and volunteer work at the local animal shelter had impressed the selection committee. She was supposed to receive a check for $10,000 and give a short speech about overcoming challenges. As Sarah navigated through the crowd, she noticed how some people stepped aside to let her pass, offering polite smiles. Others seemed to avoid eye contact altogether. She was used to both reactions and had learned not to let them bother her. Her mother, Linda, walked beside her, beaming with pride in her simple black dress that she had borrowed from a friend. "I still can't believe this is happening," Sarah whispered to her mother as they found their designated table near the front of the room. Linda squeezed her daughter's shoulder gently. "You deserve every bit of this recognition, sweetheart. All those late nights studying and your volunteer work have paid off." At the head table sat the club's board members and some of the town's most prominent citizens. Among them was Victoria Sterling, the club president's wife, known for her charity work but also for her sharp tongue and particular views about who belonged in their exclusive circles. She wore a diamond necklace that probably cost more than Sarah's family made in a year. As the evening progressed, Sarah met other scholarship recipients and their families. She felt a warm sense of belonging and hope for her future. The dinner was delicious, far fancier than anything she had ever eaten, and she tried to remember her table manners while enjoying every bite. During the cocktail hour, Sarah struck up conversations with several guests who seemed genuinely interested in her story. She talked about her plans to study environmental science and her dream of working to protect wildlife habitats. Some people were surprised by her intelligence and ambition, as if they had expected less from someone in her situation. However, Sarah couldn't help but notice a group of women at a nearby table who kept glancing in her direction and whispering among themselves. She caught fragments of their conversation and heard words like inspiration and brave, which made her uncomfortable. She had never thought of herself as particularly inspiring just for living her life. As the formal program was about to begin, Sarah felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. She had practiced her speech dozens of times in front of her bedroom mirror, wanting to make sure she represented herself and other disabled students well. The scholarship would help her achieve her dreams, and she wanted to express her gratitude properly. The master of ceremonies, a local news anchor, took the microphone and began introducing the evening's honorees. Sarah's palms grew sweaty as she waited for her name to be called. Around her, the room buzzed with conversation and the gentle clinking of silverware against china. When her category was announced, Sarah felt her heart racing. This was her moment, the culmination of years of hard work and determination. She had overcome so many obstacles to get here, from inaccessible buildings at school to people who underestimated her abilities. Tonight was proof that she could achieve anything she set her mind to. Linda reached over and gave her daughter's hand an encouraging squeeze. "You're going to do great, honey. Just speak from your heart." As Sarah prepared to wheel herself toward the stage, she noticed Victoria Sterling lean over to whisper something to the woman beside her. Both women looked in Sarah's direction and shared what appeared to be a knowing smile. Something about their expression made Sarah feel uneasy, but she pushed the feeling aside. The room began to quiet as the scholarship presentation portion of the evening commenced. Sarah adjusted her dress and checked that her speech cards were still in her small purse. She had worked so hard for this moment, and nothing was going to ruin it for her. The ambient lighting dimmed slightly as spotlights illuminated the stage area. Sarah could see the large check with her name on it waiting on an easel, and her heart swelled with gratitude. This scholarship represented more than money. It was validation that her dreams were worth pursuing and that society valued her contributions. Around the room, servers in crisp white uniforms moved quietly between tables, refilling water glasses and clearing plates. Sarah noticed one particular server, an older woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, who seemed to be paying attention to the proceedings rather than just focusing on her duties. As the moment of her introduction approached, Sarah took a deep breath and reminded herself of all the encouragement she had received from teachers, family, and friends. She thought about her younger brother who looked up to her, and her elderly neighbor who always cheered her on during her morning wheelchair races around the block. The anticipation in the room was building, and Sarah felt ready to share her story of perseverance and hope. She had no idea that in just a few minutes her perfect evening would take an unexpected and humiliating turn, or that an unlikely ally would soon step forward to change everything. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat and reached for the microphone, preparing to call Sarah's name. The moment she had been waiting for was finally here, and nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced with a warm smile, "our next scholarship recipient has shown remarkable academic excellence, despite facing significant challenges. Please welcome Sarah Martinez, this year's recipient of the Disabled Students Achievement Award." The room erupted in polite applause as Sarah began wheeling herself toward the stage. Her mother watched with tears of joy in her eyes, capturing every moment on her phone. The spotlight followed Sarah as she made her way through the tables, her navy blue dress catching the light beautifully. But as Sarah approached the stage area, she realized there was a problem. The stage was elevated about 3 feet off the ground, accessible only by a set of stairs. There was no ramp in sight. Sarah stopped at the base of the platform, looking around uncertainly. The applause began to fade as people noticed the situation. "I'm sorry," Sarah called out to the master of ceremonies, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. "Is there a ramp I can use?" The MC looked flustered, clearly unprepared for this situation. He glanced around helplessly before leaning down toward Sarah. "I'm afraid we don't have a ramp available tonight. Perhaps someone could help you up." Sarah felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment. Being carried onto a stage like a child was not how she had envisioned this moment. Before she could respond, Victoria Sterling stood up at the head table, her diamond earrings sparkling as she moved. "Oh my goodness," Victoria said in a voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Didn't anyone think to check if she could actually get up there?" She laughed, a sound that was supposed to seem light-hearted but carried a sharp edge. I mean, really, what did they expect? Several people at Victoria's table chuckled along with her comment. Sarah felt as though the floor had opened beneath her wheelchair. The woman's words cut deep, making her feel like an inconvenience rather than an honored guest. "Maybe we should just bring the award down to her," suggested another woman at the head table, speaking as if Sarah couldn't hear her. "It would be easier for everyone." The master of ceremonies, clearly wanting to move past the awkward situation, nodded quickly. "Of course, we can certainly accommodate that." He grabbed the large ceremonial check and began to descend the stairs. But Victoria Sterling wasn't finished. She turned to address her table companions, though her voice carried clearly across the now quiet room. "Honestly, I don't understand why we have to make such a spectacle of this. It's supposed to be an inspirational moment, but look how uncomfortable everyone is." Sarah's hands trembled on her wheelchair's armrests. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, some filled with pity, others with the kind of awkward discomfort that comes from witnessing someone else's humiliation. The magical evening she had dreamed about was crumbling around her. "You know," Victoria continued, apparently emboldened by the attention she was receiving, "I've always believed that charity should lift people up, not put them in situations where they clearly don't belong. This whole thing is just embarrassing for everyone involved." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people looked shocked by Victoria's bluntness while others seemed to nod in agreement. Sarah wanted to disappear, to wheel herself right out of the ballroom and never look back. Linda had risen from her seat and was making her way toward her daughter, her face a mixture of anger and protective concern. But before she could reach Sarah, Victoria delivered what felt like the final blow. "I mean, let's be honest here," Victoria said, gesturing towards Sarah with her champagne glass. "We all came here tonight to celebrate achievement and success. But this situation just makes everyone uncomfortable. Perhaps these special awards should be handled differently in the future, somewhere more appropriate for people with her limitations." The word limitations hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had spent her entire life proving that her wheelchair didn't define what she could accomplish. She had graduated as valedictorian, volunteered countless hours at the animal shelter, and earned this scholarship through pure merit. Yet here she was being reduced to nothing more than her disability. Several guests began shifting uncomfortably in their seats, while others pulled out their phones to record what was happening. The master of ceremonies stood frozen at the bottom of the stage stairs, the large check in his hands. Clearly unsure how to proceed, "Mrs. Sterling," he began tentatively. "Perhaps we should—" "Oh, don't misunderstand me," Victoria interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm sure she's very nice and has worked hard within her capabilities. But let's not pretend this isn't awkward for everyone. Sometimes kindness means being honest about these situations." Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of all these people. She had faced discrimination before, but never so publicly. Never when she was supposed to be celebrated. The room had fallen into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the quiet sounds of silverware and glasses being set down on tables. Everyone seemed to be waiting for someone else to do something, to say something to make this terrible moment end. From the corner of her eye, Sarah noticed the older server she had seen earlier, the woman with the kind eyes and graying hair. The server had stopped her work and was standing perfectly still, her face showing a mix of shock and growing anger as she witnessed Victoria's cruel display. Sarah's mother finally reached her side and knelt down beside the wheelchair. "Come on, honey," Linda whispered. "We don't need to stay here and listen to this." But even as Linda prepared to wheel her daughter away from the humiliating scene, Sarah found herself unable to move. Part of her wanted to flee, but another part refused to let Victoria Sterling drive her away from an honor she had rightfully earned. The server with the kind eyes took a step forward, her jaw set with determination. Something was about to happen that would change everything. The older server set down her water pitcher on a nearby table and walked directly toward the front of the room. Her name tag read Margaret, and despite her simple uniform, she carried herself with a dignity that commanded attention. The room remained uncomfortably quiet as she approached Victoria Sterling's table. "Excuse me, Mrs. Sterling," Margaret said in a clear, steady voice that carried across the ballroom. Her tone was respectful but firm. Victoria looked up with surprise and annoyance. "Yes, what is it? Can't you see we're in the middle of an important moment here?" "I can see exactly what's happening here," Margaret replied, her gaze never wavering from Victoria's face. "And I think it's time someone spoke up for what's right." Several people at nearby tables began to pay closer attention. The master of ceremonies still stood awkwardly with the ceremonial check, unsure whether to continue with the presentation or wait for this unexpected interruption to resolve itself. Victoria's eyebrows rose with indignation. "I beg your pardon? I don't think the serving staff needs to involve themselves in matters they don't understand." Margaret took a step closer, her voice growing stronger. "Oh, but I do understand, Mrs. Sterling. I understand more than you might think. You see, I've been watching this young woman all evening, and I've seen nothing but grace, intelligence, and kindness from her." Sarah looked up at Margaret with surprise and growing hope. No one had stood up for her like this before, especially not someone who barely knew her. "What I've also seen," Margaret continued, "is a grown woman using her position of privilege to humiliate a 17-year-old girl who has done nothing wrong except achieve something remarkable despite facing challenges you'll never understand." A murmur began to ripple through the crowd. Some people nodded in agreement, while others looked shocked that a server was directly confronting one of the club's most prominent members. Victoria's face flushed red with anger. "How dare you speak to me that way? Do you know who I am? I could have you fired with one phone call." "I know exactly who you are," Margaret said calmly. "You're Victoria Sterling, and yes, you have power and money and social connections. But right now you're also someone who is bullying a young woman in front of hundreds of people, and that tells me everything I need to know about your character." The ballroom had fallen completely silent now. Even the other servers had stopped their work to listen. Sarah felt a mixture of gratitude and concern for this brave woman who was putting her job on the line. Margaret turned to address the broader room, her voice carrying clearly to every corner. "This young woman earned this scholarship through her academic achievements and community service. She didn't ask for special treatment or accommodations beyond basic accessibility. She simply wanted to be recognized for her hard work just like any other student." "The real problem here," Margaret continued, turning back to Victoria, isn't that there's no ramp to the stage. The problem is that no one thought to provide one. And instead of fixing that oversight with grace and dignity, you chose to make this young woman feel ashamed for something that isn't her fault. Victoria stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I don't have to listen to this from the help. You're completely out of line, am I? Margaret asked, her voice remaining steady despite the confrontation. Let me tell you what's out of line. Out of line is making a young woman feel unwelcome at an event meant to honor her achievements. Out of line is suggesting that someone doesn't belong somewhere because they use a wheelchair. Out of line is using your privilege to tear someone down instead of lifting them up. Several people in the audience began to applaud, starting as scattered claps but quickly growing into sustained applause. Sarah felt tears in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than humiliation. Margaret walked over to Sarah and knelt down beside her wheelchair, speaking in a gentler tone. My dear, I want you to know that everything that woman said was wrong. You belong here. You've earned your place here through your own merit and hard work. Thank you, Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But you don't have to risk your job for me. Margaret smiled warmly. Some things are more important than a job, sweetheart. And besides, I think you might be surprised by what happens next. She stood up and faced the crowd again. Now I have a proposal for how we can handle this situation properly. Instead of making this young woman accept her award in a way that's convenient for our inadequate planning, why don't we find a better solution? Margaret looked directly at the Master of Ceremonies. Sir, I suggest you bring that microphone down here so Sarah can give her speech from where she is. Let's make the stage come to her instead of expecting her to somehow magically overcome barriers we should have removed in the first place. The MC nodded quickly, clearly grateful for a solution that didn't involve further conflict. Of course, absolutely. That's an excellent idea. As he began to descend the stairs with the microphone, Margaret turned to address Victoria one final time. Mrs. Sterling, you have a choice to make right now. You can continue to embarrass yourself in this organization with your cruelty, or you can sit down and show the respect that this young woman has earned and deserves. Victoria looked around the room and seemed to realize that the tide had turned against her. Most of the guests were now looking at her with disapproval rather than support. She sat down heavily, her face still flushed with anger and embarrassment. Margaret returned to Sarah's side as the Master of Ceremonies approached with the microphone. Now then, she said with a warm smile, I believe you have some important things to say to us all. The Master of Ceremonies handed Sarah the microphone with an apologetic smile. Please take all the time you need, he said quietly. The large ceremonial check was positioned beside her wheelchair where everyone could see it clearly. Sarah looked out at the crowd of faces, some curious, some supportive, others still uncomfortable from the confrontation they had just witnessed. Margaret stood nearby, offering an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began to speak. Thank you all for being here tonight, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I have to admit this evening hasn't gone exactly as I imagined it would. A few people chuckled softly, helping to ease some of the tension in the room. When I was preparing my speech, I thought I would talk about overcoming obstacles and pursuing dreams despite challenges. I never expected to demonstrate those very principles right here in front of you all. Sarah glanced toward Victoria Sterling, who was staring down at her plate, then looked back at the audience. What happened tonight actually illustrates something very important that I hope we can all learn from. The biggest barriers people with disabilities face aren't always physical ones like stairs or high curbs. Often the biggest barriers are the assumptions and attitudes of others. Margaret smiled proudly as Sarah continued with growing confidence. I didn't come here tonight asking for pity or inspiration. I came here because I earned this scholarship through the same hard work and dedication that any student would need. I study late into the night, I volunteer at the animal shelter every weekend, and I maintain a 4.0 GPA while also managing the daily challenges of living with a disability. The room was now completely focused on Sarah's words. Even some of the people who had seemed uncomfortable earlier were leaning forward to listen. The woman who stood up for me tonight, Margaret, showed more grace and courage in 5 minutes than I've seen from some people in positions of power my entire life. She reminded me that dignity isn't about what you can or cannot do physically. It's about how you treat others and how you stand up for what's right. Sarah looked directly at Margaret. Thank you for showing everyone here what true leadership looks like. Thank you for seeing me as a person worthy of respect, not as an object of pity or an inconvenience to be managed. The applause started slowly, but built to a thunderous ovation. Many people rose to their feet, directing their applause toward both Sarah and Margaret. When the applause died down, Sarah continued, "I want to use this scholarship to study environmental science because I believe that fighting for the protection of our planet requires the same kind of determination I use every day to navigate a world that isn't always designed for people like me. It requires seeing beyond immediate obstacles to imagine better solutions." She paused, looking around the room with newfound confidence. "Tonight we all learned something important. When faced with a barrier, we have choices. We can use that barrier as an excuse to exclude people, or we can find ways to remove the barrier and make space for everyone to participate fully." Sarah's mother wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her daughter transform what could have been a humiliating experience into a powerful teaching moment. "I hope that in the future, when the Riverside Country Club hosts events like this, they'll remember to make them accessible from the beginning, not as an afterthought or accommodation, but as a basic part of good planning that recognizes the value and dignity of all participants." The Master of Ceremonies nodded emphatically, clearly taking mental notes for future events. "Most importantly," Sarah continued, "I hope we'll all remember that real charity isn't about feeling superior to the people we're trying to help. Real charity is about recognizing the strength and potential in others and creating opportunities for everyone to shine." As Sarah spoke these words, Victoria Sterling shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the meaning clearly not lost on her. "This scholarship means the world to me, not just because of the financial support, but because it represents belief in my potential. Thank you to the selection committee for seeing past my disability to recognize my achievements and dreams." Sarah handed the microphone back to the Master of Ceremonies and was immediately surrounded by people wanting to congratulate her and express their support. Her speech had turned what began as an embarrassing situation into a triumph of dignity and grace. Margaret approached through the crowd, her eyes shining with admiration. "That was absolutely beautiful, dear. You handled yourself with such maturity and wisdom." "I couldn't have done it without you standing up for me first," Sarah replied, reaching out to squeeze Margaret's hand. "You saved this whole evening for me." As the crowd began to disperse and conversations resumed around the ballroom, Sarah noticed something unexpected. Victoria Sterling had quietly left her table and was walking in their direction. Sarah felt her muscles tense, unsure what to expect. Victoria approached hesitantly, her earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like shame. She stopped a few feet away from Sarah's wheelchair, seeming to struggle with what to say. Margaret positioned herself protectively near Sarah, clearly ready to intervene if necessary. But what happened next surprised everyone, including Victoria herself. 6 months later, Sarah wheeled herself up the newly installed ramp to the Riverside Country Club's main entrance, where a beautiful bronze plaque read, "In memory of David Sterling, a place where everyone belongs." Victoria had insisted on honoring her brother's memory as part of the club's transformation. The changes were remarkable. Not only had the club been made fully accessible, but it had become a model for inclusive design throughout the city. The scholarship program had expanded exactly as Victoria promised, and 5 deserving students with disabilities were about to receive their awards at tonight's ceremony. Margaret, now officially the club's director of community outreach, greeted Sarah at the entrance with a warm hug. She had traded her server's uniform for a professional suit, though she still carried herself with the same dignity and grace that had impressed everyone that fateful night. "Are you ready for tonight?" Margaret asked as they walked toward the ballroom together. "More ready than I was 6 months ago," Sarah laughed, "though I have to admit I'm nervous about giving the keynote speech." The evening's program featured Sarah as the guest speaker, sharing her story and the lessons learned from that transformative night. Her speech had been requested by numerous organizations since word spread about what had happened at the country club. Victoria approached them in the hallway, carrying a folder of documents and wearing a smile that seemed genuinely happy, rather than the forced politeness of their first meeting. Her transformation had been as remarkable as the club's physical changes. "Sarah, I just got off the phone with the mayor's office," Victoria said excitedly. "They want to model the city's new accessibility initiative after what we've accomplished here. 3 other organizations have already committed to following our example. That's incredible. Sarah replied. Your brother would be so proud. Victoria's eyes misted slightly, as they still did whenever David was mentioned, but her smile remained bright. I think he would be. I finally feel like I'm honoring his memory in the right way. The three women entered the ballroom, which had been completely redesigned since that night 6 months ago. The stage now had both stairs and a ramp, and every table was positioned to ensure wheelchair accessibility. More importantly, the atmosphere felt different, warmer, more welcoming, truly inclusive. As the evening's program began, Sarah reflected on how much had changed. She had started her first year of college with confidence and purpose, her scholarship allowing her to focus on her studies without financial stress. Her relationship with her mother had grown even stronger as Linda watched her daughters. Grace under pressure inspire positive change in their community. Margaret had discovered talents she never knew she possessed, becoming a sought-after consultant on accessibility and inclusion issues. Her courage that night had opened doors she had never imagined possible, proving that heroism often comes from the most unexpected places. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation had been Victoria's. She had not only funded the expanded scholarship program but had become a passionate advocate for disability rights. She regularly spoke at conferences about confronting unconscious bias and had established a foundation in her brother's name that worked to make public spaces more accessible across the state. When it came time for Sarah's keynote speech, she approached the podium with confidence, using the same ramp that now made the stage accessible to everyone. Looking out at the audience, she saw faces filled with genuine interest and respect, rather than the mixture of pity and discomfort she had encountered 6 months earlier. When I received my scholarship here 6 months ago, Sarah began, I thought the evening would be about recognizing past achievements. I had no idea it would become the catalyst for so much positive change in our community. She looked toward Margaret and Victoria, both seated at the head table. That night, I learned that real change doesn't come from avoiding difficult conversations or pretending problems don't exist. It comes from having the courage to confront our biases and the wisdom to learn from our mistakes. The audience listened intently as Sarah continued. I also learned that heroes don't always look like we expect them to. Sometimes a hero is a server who risks her job to stand up for what's right. Sometimes a hero is someone who has the humility to admit when they're wrong and the determination to make amends. Sarah's speech went on to detail the concrete changes that had resulted from that evening, not just at the country club, but throughout the city. The accessibility improvements had benefited far more people than just those with obvious disabilities, helping elderly citizens, parents with strollers, and anyone who struggled with mobility issues. Victoria Sterling stood before Sarah and Margaret, her designer dress and expensive jewelry suddenly seeming like armor that could no longer protect her from the weight of her actions. The confident woman who had spoken so cruelly just minutes earlier now appeared smaller, vulnerable in a way that surprised everyone watching. Victoria began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. She looked around nervously, aware that several people were observing this interaction with intense curiosity. Sarah waited patiently, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Despite everything that had happened, she felt no anger toward this woman, only a sadness for someone who seemed to carry so much bitterness inside. I owe you an apology, Victoria finally managed, her voice much quieter than it had been earlier. What I said was inexcusable. There's no justification for how I treated you. Margaret remained close by, still protective but willing to let the conversation unfold. I don't know what came over me, Victoria continued, her composure beginning to crack. Actually, that's not true. I do know, and that makes it even worse. Sarah leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? Victoria glanced around, then seemed to make a decision to be completely honest. My younger brother was born with cerebral palsy. Growing up, I watched my parents struggle with the constant doctor visits, the special equipment, the way people stared at us when we went out as a family. This revelation caught both Sarah and Margaret off guard. Whatever they had expected Victoria to say, it wasn't this. I was embarrassed by him, Victoria admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I was ashamed of my own brother, and I hated myself for feeling that way. When I got older, I threw myself into charity work, telling myself I was making amends for those horrible feelings. Tears began to form in Victoria's eyes. But tonight, seeing you up there, so confident and accomplished, it brought back all those old feelings of shame and guilt. Instead of celebrating your success, I lashed out because you reminded me of everything I've tried to bury about my own past. Sarah reached out and gently touched Victoria's hand. Where is your brother now? Victoria's composure finally broke completely. He died in a car accident 5 years ago. We had grown apart after I went to college. I was always too busy with my own life, too uncomfortable with his disability to spend much time with him. I never got the chance to apologize to him for being such an awful sister. The ballroom continued buzzing with activity around them, but their small circle felt like a private sanctuary for this raw, honest conversation. I've been trying to honor his memory through charity work, Victoria continued. But tonight I realized I've been doing it all wrong. I've been treating disabled people like projects to fix rather than individuals to respect, just like I treated my own brother. Margaret, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong, especially so publicly. Victoria looked at Margaret with surprise, perhaps not expecting kindness from the woman she had tried to get fired just minutes earlier. I don't deserve your kindness after how I spoke to you. Maybe not, Margaret replied honestly. But forgiveness isn't always about what people deserve. Sometimes it's about what we choose to give. Sarah nodded in agreement. Your brother wouldn't want his memory to be connected to guilt and shame. He would want it to inspire you to do better, to be better. How can you be so understanding after what I did to you? Victoria asked, genuinely puzzled by Sarah's grace. Because holding on to anger would only hurt me, Sarah replied simply. And because I think your brother would be proud to see you learning from this experience. Victoria wiped her eyes with a tissue that Margaret quietly offered her. I want to make this right somehow. Not just with an apology, but with real action. What do you have in mind? Sarah asked. First, I'm going to personally ensure that this club becomes fully accessible. Ramps, elevators, accessible restrooms, everything. And I'm going to work with the board to create new policies that require accessibility to be considered from the beginning. For every event we plan, Margaret smiled approvingly. That sounds like a wonderful start. But I want to do more than that, Victoria continued, looking directly at Sarah. I want to increase the amount of the disabled student scholarship. Instead of one $10,000 award each year, I want to fund 5 awards of $20,000 each. Sarah's eyes widened. That would help so many students. It's the least I can do, Victoria said. And I was hoping. I was wondering if you might consider working with me on this project. Help me understand what other barriers exist and how we can address them properly. Sarah looked at her mother, who had been quietly watching this extraordinary conversation unfold. Linda nodded encouragingly. I'd be honored to help, Sarah said. But I have one condition. Victoria looked nervous. What's that? I want Margaret to be part of this project too. What she did tonight showed real leadership, and I think her perspective would be invaluable. Margaret looked surprised. Oh, I don't know if that's appropriate. You're exactly the kind of person we need, Victoria interrupted, and this time her interruption was one of enthusiasm rather than rudeness. Someone who's willing to speak truth to power and fight for what's right. As the 3 women talked, a small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, including the club president and several board members who had witnessed the entire evening's events. The president approached them cautiously. Mrs. Sterling, Miss Martinez, Mrs. He paused, realizing he didn't know Margaret's last name. Thompson, Margaret supplied. Margaret Thompson. Mrs. Thompson, the president continued. I've been watching what happened here tonight, and I want you all to know that the board will be having an emergency meeting tomorrow morning to discuss immediate changes to our policies and procedures. Victoria stood up straighter. Good, and I'll be presenting a formal proposal for the expanded scholarship program and accessibility improvements at that meeting. The president nodded approvingly. Excellent. And Mrs. Thompson, I hope you'll consider joining our Diversity and Inclusion Committee. We clearly need your perspective and courage on our team.